Hello, welcome. I am Rowan Conway. I'm head of the Mission Oriented Innovation Network at IIPP, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you here today to join us to talk about the reflecting on mission-oriented innovation in a time of COVID. We're very privileged to have Mariana and two of our key collaborators over the course of the year come and join to have the kind of reflective vibe, an end of year chat among friends. So I'm going to conjure up the kind of fireside chat momentum. I haven't got any mince pies, but let's imagine we did, and a nice cup of tea, to really have a think about what did we learn this year. To give you a bit of context about the Mission Oriented Innovation Network, we have grown enormously at IIPP this year. It's a growing group of global policymakers who all come together to explore how mission-oriented innovation policy might help tackle grand challenges. But they do so in many different ways. MOIN was launched in March 2018 with the idea of bringing together partners to learn from like-minded organisations from diverse backgrounds. And I think that's an important part of what we do, insofar as we have over 70 leading global policymaking institutions, including state investment banks, innovation agencies and sectoral units, all setting kind of strategic direction for governance, but sometimes in a place-based way and sometimes in more of a structural economic way. But every organisation is interested in public purpose and sharing challenges and opportunities they face while trying to nurture public value. Now this year, MOIN members have been profoundly changed by COVID, and the shifts we're seeing now in how members have both adapted their working practices, but also how the year has shifted their approach to missions and how they think about financing. COVID-19 is a devastating health crisis, and it has broad public health implications and a looming economic crisis alongside it, which may be much worse than 2008. But out of this crisis, there's also a series of unique opportunities to restructure our economic systems and institutions in a way that promotes inclusion, equity, justice, and sustainability. So as I say, this event is akin to a fireside chat with Mariana Mazzucato, who has this year been collaborating with such a wide, diverse range of people from around the world, including the Pope and the World Health Organization and our friends that are joined here today. So we are going to talk about the work that Mariana has done in Italy, but also sharing insights with us today. We are very glad to be joined by Georgia Gould, the leader of Camden Council, to discuss the great work of the Camden Renewal Commission and how the London Borough is looking to capture this opportunity presented by the pandemic. And also we're joined by Mzukisi Qobou, who's head of the Wits School of Governance in South Africa and has been part of the President Cyril Ramaphosa's Presidential Economic Advisory Council in South Africa. So I'm going to pass over to Mariana to start in terms of thinking more broadly about the kinds of things that have happened this year to the organisations that we partner with at IIPP, and how COVID has really changed, how the pandemic has really changed the approach to missions. Over to you, Mariana.
Thanks, Rowan. First of all, it is fantastic, not just an honor, but really exciting to be on this panel with Georgia and Mzu, because with Georgia, of course, we're co-chairing the Camden Renewal Commission, and with Mzu over the last 2 years, we've been trying, even pre-COVID, to, in the Presidential Economic Advisory Council, help bring a different direction to South African growth. And in both cases, working with this concept of mission. So I think the viewers, listeners will have a great opportunity also to ask questions to both Georgia and Mzu on the details, right? Because details matter. It's not enough to talk about these grand kind of missions, purpose, what does it actually look like on the ground? And what can we learn also from what doesn't work? I think it's really important for these conversations to be as much about the challenges as the opportunities. So kind of big picture stuff. I think one of the things that COVID has given us is an opportunity really to test the talk about the need to move in a different way, right? There's all this talk pre-COVID about a Green Deal, about the need to have more inclusive growth. Just think of all the inequality that exists around the world, and this notion of inclusive, sustainable growth. It's all out there, but then unless we implement very, very specific new governance mechanisms and new designs for policy making, we simply don't move in that direction. And this is very much, what IIPP is about, which is to talk about this directionality of growth explicitly, and to ask what does it mean for policymaking in particular. So all the talk, of course, is always about fixing market failures, and we, in all our propaganda that we put out there, always begin with, actually what we need is market shaping and market co-creating, not just market fixing. Because by definition, if you're always fixing, you will always, by definition, it's actually designed into the system, be too little, too late. And that's really where this notion of missions comes in, missions as a way to bring common purpose to public-private partnerships. So what COVID gives us is this amazing testing ground, right? Both in terms of the vaccine, right? There's no point in actually having a vaccine if we don't actually govern it in such a way to really foster global collective intelligence. And that has a lot to do, for example, with how intellectual property rights are governed, and why the World Health Organization and others have been calling for a people's vaccine, and to actually govern the process of innovation to foster collective intelligence through patent pools, but also making sure that the pricing actually allows accessibility, but also the kind of manufacturing side, the real kind of public rollout of the vaccine is hugely important. And there, as we know, if we look at the testing, the test and trace testing, and all the other kind of things that have been required, including PPE, personal protection equipment, it's often been that rollout process that's been a problem. And that's really about capacity, both capacity inside the private sector, and often that capacity perhaps doesn't exist, especially with an over financialization of many companies globally that have really been focused too much on the short term and not necessarily even thinking of their own kind of long run growth. But also the public sector capacity of rolling out something as important as frontline, PPE. So we need to understand why it didn't work, and why it did actually work in some countries that are even, much poorer in many ways than, some advanced industrialized economies like the UK one. So the UK one ended up overly relying, as we know, on consulting companies, Deloitte, PwC. There was a whole condemnation of this by a Tory lord called Lord Agnew, saying, we have infantilized government by this over-reliance on consulting companies, not enough public sector kind of dynamic capabilities and investment within. And yet some, parts of the world like Vietnam or Kerala, a region in India, I'm not saying they did perfectly, because this has definitely been challenging for everyone, but their own investments in their own public administration over the last 10 years has been absolutely critical. And I'm keen for Mzu to pick up on this later, because he's really a global leader in thinking about dynamic public administration. But I don't want to talk too much, even though I know you said that we each have 10 minutes, but it'll probably be good to get a bit more a conversation here. But just another thing that I think COVID is super important is the public-private partnership. So, huge amounts of money are being injected into the system now, as they were after the financial crisis. In the financial crisis, the trillions that were injected to a large extent went back to the financial sector because they weren't actually accompanied with proper kind of real fiscal stimulus. And what's really important now are kind of a threefold thing, which is, first of all, let's not do that again, but also the fiscal stimulus itself cannot just be about kind of shovel-ready projects, right? It actually needs to really be embedded within the kind of social and physical infrastructure that we need. So stronger health systems, obviously, but also more sustainable physical infrastructure, because it's really easy to say, okay, let's build houses and let's build bridges and roads because we need to, stimulate the economy in a Keynesian way. But the Green Deal objectives have to be, at the center of that. And so, I'm sure Georgia will talk about this, but some of the work we've been doing in Camden has been, for example, focused on places like housing estates as places where the sustainable growth strategy happens during the COVID recovery. So place-based strategy, bringing sustainability to the core, like in Sweden, where we're also working with the government there, they've thought about school meals as the place where we focus our sustainable growth strategy. So in the UK, we needed a footballer in Manchester to remind the government, hey, during lockdown, kids have to be having not only free school meals at school, but also during the holidays because of the struggle that their family is going through. But it's not enough just to say, give them school meals. That should be not rocket science. Transform the school meals to be healthy, tasty, and sustainable, and have the whole value chain of the school meals, especially in a moment where we've all realized just how important schooling is for those who are not having access to it, whether it's the digital divide or, again, being in homes that are really suffering, using that as the vehicle through which we concretely deliver a carbon neutral agenda. And just that public-private partnership point, the thing that we've really been stressing is the issue of conditionalities. So the way that in some countries like France or Denmark, they've actually brought conditions to the table to be able to access the recovery. In France, they, both Air France and Renault were asked to reduce their carbon emissions as part of the recovery plan for those sectors. In Denmark, those countries that have been using and abusing tax evasion mechanisms won't be able to access the recovery, right? So using these recovery funds, which businesses of course need, but to help transform them instead of just bailing them out, that's another really important, I think, social innovation that COVID is teaching us how to do. And it has to be seen really as a win-win. It can't be seen as a punishment. This is about partnership and symbiotic ecosystems, not parasitic ones. And I'm happy to later come back in to talk about Italy, because I know you wanted me to do that, but I think this is a good moment to pass over to our colleagues.
I think that's great. I think that I was going to suggest that actually there's you used a lovely phrase there, social infrastructure, and that made me think maybe we should pause to move over to Georgia actually and start understanding a little bit more about what it means to do this work in the context of a place. I think in Camden you're aiming to do exactly what Mariana had outlined there, develop a more inclusive and sustainable society and economy. Can you tell us more a little bit about the Camden's Economic Renewal Commission and the missions that you've been developing in these interesting times on Zoom?
Yeah, no, I'm so excited to be here to talk about this work, because it really is one of the bright spots of what has been a really dark and difficult year, where we've seen huge need in our community, a lot of trauma, and I think that taking the time in the midst of all that difficulty and emergency response to think about how we deal with the systemic issues this pandemic has brought up, how we mobilize our communities around lasting change, feels like such important work. And really thank you to IIPP and to Mariana and yourself for kind of helping us kind of keep our heads above all the emergency work and to think long term. Just to kind of briefly introduce Camden. Camden is a place of extremes, really. It's a place of extreme wealth. The square mile around King's Cross has some of the world's biggest businesses, Google, Facebook, world-leading institutions like UCL and Francis Crick, Europe's largest biomedical research centre, and it produces huge wealth for the national economy. But right next to that are some of the poorest parts, not just of London, but of the UK and Europe, and almost half of children in Camden grow up in poverty. And that poverty has deepened during the crisis. So, we are hearing on a daily basis heartbreaking stories of parents who are struggling to, feed their children, to choose between food and a winter jacket or school trainers. So huge need next to that wealth. And just one story that I think kind of really brings that to life is one of our primary schools in very close to King's Cross Station. For those who know the heart of London. We found at the start of the pandemic that the vast majority, almost 3/4 of the children, didn't have access to a device to learn on, despite the fact they were, just next to this huge economic centre. So we see that juxtaposition every day, and we've had a long-term ambition to use our levers as a local state to try and transform that, to try and ensure that everyone who lives in our borough has a stake in the wealth and opportunity that is created there, which they are part of creating. So it's not just a kind of mission around redistribution, but actually whole-scale economic change. And that's why we were really excited to work with Mariana and the Institute, because I think that we really share the same values. So when it comes to the Renewal Commission, I think we wanted to have a place that brought together some of the kind of experts and institutions in our borough with the expertise and the lived experience of our citizens to really plan out how we mobilize that change. And the missions framework works really well for us, because it has some big calls to action that everyone can get behind, whether you're a community activist or a big university like UCL. There is a way to come together around that. And we wanted we have a real ambition in Camden to share power, and we know that even though some of our residents are in the heart of London, they feel just as, incredibly far away from power. So we wanted this to be something that was co-created with our citizens. So we had a period of listening to communities of what their experience of the pandemic through kind of stories, through lived experience, through artwork, through creativity. And some of the big issues that came out of that were the extent and scale of poverty, and a particular focus around food poverty. Still real concern about the climate crisis, which and that any recovery had tackling the climate crisis at its heart. Concern about the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on our Black, Asian, minority communities, and what that said about systemic race inequality, and how we needed to address that. And then, as Mariana said, that some of the parts of our borough were hit worse than others, and that there were places where lots of issues were coming together, housing shortages and extreme overcrowding, unemployment, and some of the kind of issues around poverty that I just talked about. So the missions that we've come up with, and they're forward to kind of directly address that, are there's a mission about increasing the diversity of leadership across the borough, and we think that to do that you have to take on some of that systemic race inequality that I talked about. We have a mission about which is very much rooted in our estates, which is around bringing, as Mariana said, ensuring that the green and climate sustainability agenda is really happening in our estates, and that it changes people's lives, so that people who are living on fuel poverty feel that change, that they're the green areas that are there, ones that they can use, that the air quality around those estates reduces. And so we're tackling social justice as well as the climate crisis, but also that we are ensuring that we are bringing some of the creativity and opportunity in our borough to our estates, and that we're recognising the capacity and agency and creativity of all of our residents. Another mission was around access to healthy food and addressing food poverty, which is really clear and an urgent need to take on. And finally, around ensuring our young people are safe, because unfortunately we've had a huge issue of knife crime and youth safety in our borough, but also that they have economic opportunities, and we're investing in those economic opportunities. So there is real excitement and energy around those missions, and we are working with our citizens to create a mix of online and physical kind of pop-up spaces where citizens can design what outcomes look like, what needs to change in a year, 5 years, 10 years to make that a reality, and bringing together the resource in the borough. So we're kind of in the middle of making it happen, but I think the framework is really powerful in allowing innovation and allowing people to step forward, and a kind of equality of impact from all the different kind of groups in the borough.
Thank you, Georgia. It would be interesting to find out a little bit more. You referred to your co-design process and the fact that that you've had to navigate that through various tiers, closures, lockdowns. How have you gone about that co-design process? How has that changed in light of the pandemic?
We were, just to give one really concrete example, we were in the middle of the Health Citizens Assembly on the future of health that at the start of the pandemic, and that a Citizens Assembly it brings together a representative group of place, so in terms of tenure, age, background, and that was it's a face-to-face deliberative process which requires time spent together, and so we had to move that online, and it required a huge amount of work. Many of the participants didn't have access to devices at home, so we had to make sure that we put in place devices and Wi-Fi for those people to be able to participate, BSL interpreters. There was members of the Citizens Assembly where English was a second language, so we had to have interpreters there, and to allow a dialogue required a real investment of resource in making sure that everyone had access to even start an online dialogue. I think that kind of moving forward, our work with the co-design around the commission, we have brought together some of those experts by experience in our borough. So that including our citizen scientists, community researchers, voluntary sector organisations that have really deep links in the community. And we're we are designing in place some of those opportunities for conversations. So kind of pop-up spaces where people can come and contribute their ideas or talk to somebody, and then some online spaces, but real effort to make sure that they're inclusive, and that does definitely require investment, and that's something that we are having to invest in as a local authority. And I think the final thing I'd just say, and I think it's really important, is that the pandemic has shown how important the capacity of the local state is. And, you know, all solutions that have been locally led, I feel, have worked because we can draw on the energy and partnerships in our community. And as you said earlier, so I think Mariana was saying that some of those national solutions haven't worked. But we're in Britain kind of after 10 years of austerity, where the capacity of a local state has been really decimated. And I do, you know, this kind of work with communities does require investment, and it's I think that's one of the shifts I would love to see, love to call for as part of this process, is real investment in local leadership and local capacity.
And we've certainly seen this. Thank you so much, Georgia. We've certainly seen this across the MOIN network, where we have a number of local authorities and municipalities who are part of the network, and being able to have that balance between kind of efficiency and resilience, and actually being able to really invest in their capacity and not have, as Mariana said, around kind of parasitic consultancy contracts, but rather, you know, catalytic investment back in. So how do you actually have the learning, and that you're able to really build that resilient investment so that you're able to respond, you know, sense and respond in the future, not just build it as a one-off capacity. We saw that with a couple of our placements for our IIPP MPA as well this year. We're working with Hackney Council, understanding new forms of need that were arising as a result, and then recognizing how do they pivot to supplying this need while also maintaining, you know, the business as usual as well. So it sounds there's a lot of resonance there. I'm going to pass over to Mzou now, because I think that interestingly, Mzou and Mariana and Rainer have been working on the kind of concept of state capacity and actually thinking about the delivery of these missions. So it would be great, Mzou, if you could give us a kind of flavour of actually what you've been working on with the President's Economic Advisory Council in South Africa, but then actually how the delivery of these missions, what's needed to be in place to sort of build on what Mariana was saying, that state capacity to really deliver. You're on mute.
Sorry. Thanks, Rowan. It's such a fantastic feeling to be with friends and sharing my observations on missions in South Africa. I think when we were appointed as the Economic Advisory Council, we had absolutely no idea that we were going to be caught up in the maelstrom of a health crisis and a very tough economic strain. At the time, we were all optimistic about the prospects of South Africa, and that for the first time we were going to get it right in turning the economy around and in addressing long-standing socio-economic challenges. As many of you would know, South Africa has come out of very difficult period of apartheid in 1994, and to rebuild post-1994 has been really very difficult for the country. It laid the initial basis for macroeconomic stability, tried to put in place measures to create jobs in the economy, and sought to reindustrialize the economy by putting together advisory structures before to try and understand some of the constraints to growth despite macroeconomic stability. And before we knew it, we countenanced the 2009 financial crisis, from which South Africa has not been able to recover. By the time we were hit by the COVID-19 storm, we were still rediscovering our bearings. And the major challenges that are facing the country relate to high levels of unemployment, especially youth unemployment at 60%. And that is a critical mission to resolve, because that's cauldron of social discontent in the future. South Africa is a leading, is the most unequal economy in the world. It used to be Brazil, and we overtook Brazil in the last, I think, 6 years ago. And we still have high poverty levels with very high dependency ratios in poor Black communities. So we are a very bifurcated society. We have juxtapositions of wealth and poverty. The rural divide is still very acute. We have very despondent young people in poor townships, and we have pockets of success and prosperity in towns or in metros such as your Sentin, as well as other suburbia around the country. But we live in a very abnormal economic arrangement. So when we came in with, this was a very exciting project, and COVID-19 came, and we had to pivot and think about how to best advise government to get a good handle on the pandemic, because it's a nexus between a health crisis and an economic crisis. And our work in the main has been divided in various streams that look at energy transitions, infrastructure, state capacity, macroeconomic work, agriculture, and land reform. And my observation throughout this period has been that governance and state capacity matter for a country like South Africa, plagued by social inequalities that I've highlighted, but also its public value eroded by corruption that has set in for over a decade. A lot of the work in driving social and economic change in the country has been undermined by grand scale corruption. Currently in South Africa, we have a commission of inquiry into what is called state capture in state-owned enterprises and elsewhere in government. At the coalface of public service delivery, that is at the municipal level, there has been, over the past years, a lack of traction in creating, say, social and economic infrastructure for, especially in poor municipalities. One of the innovations that have come out of the pandemic has been redesigning an approach or a paradigm to address social and economic infrastructure through the district development model, which is akin to a joined up but diffused governance. It borrows heavily from the work that Michael Baba did at Number 10, back I think back during Blair years. I mean, it does have its limitations, but it's a good start in trying to get a good handle on improving delivery of social services. The other area has been that of digital divide. South Africa is, on the surface, it has a high ICT coverage. Amongst the middle classes, you have a very active use of ICT products and services. There's internet connectivity. But if you scratch beneath the surface, you begin to realize that the digital layout of the country is bifurcated between an excluded rural communities and urban sectors that are highly connected. Even amongst the urban sectors, you have a divide between your affluent areas such as your Johannesburg and other metros, and the townships and peri-urban urban areas. So one of the improvements that I've seen during the COVID-19 period is the acceleration of the auction of spectrum. We are in the middle of that. It's not happened yet, and I think it could deliver great opportunities for South Africa if we were to get it right. And finally, and there's a lot to say on this, but the final point I would like to make is that there's a long-standing mistrust between the private sector and government, and this undermines the extent to which we're able to build shared value, to tackle some of the problems that I've identified, and also to deliver on the critical missions that would yield quality of life outcomes on a shared basis for the South African citizens. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mzou. It's fascinating how the parallels really in terms of the kind of the bifurcation, as you said, the juxtaposition of wealth and poverty, the concentrations of digital exclusivity, and so it's interesting that these challenges arise at different scales. Mariana, do you want to come in here and talk about other areas of your work where this has been the case too?
I think we were gonna maybe also reflect on what's happening in Italy, which again, very much in parallel. I mean, I guess this whole question of the digital divide, but also inequality really being seen at the postcode level, right? It used to be North and South, but what we increasingly see globally, this is definitely true in the United States, you know, North, South used to be more poor. Now it's the New York metropolitan region at the postcode level is where you really see the stark inequality. And I know that's true both in South Africa and in Camden Council. What's interesting in Italy is of course one of the member states of the European Union. And for the first time, I mean, what's really kind of positive that's happening is that Europe, unlike in the financial crisis where the recovery was conditional on cuts, right? There was the whole, Varoufakis in Greece rebelling against the fact that in order to get any aid after the financial crisis, countries had to commit to having, zero deficits or very low ones. This time around, luckily, the stimulus, which is quite large, it's just under €1 trillion euros as part of the next generation EU recovery package, it's actually conditional on investment that is strategic, that is, using our words, kind of broadly challenge oriented around a specifically climate change. So the whole kind of Green Deal policies, the idea is don't lose track of that, put them at the center of the recovery, and the digital divide that Mzou was just talking about. However, what becomes really frustrating, coming back to my point before about Kerala and Vietnam, is that if countries haven't actually, over the course of, say, at least the last decade, been investing within their structures, within their public administration, their ability to govern processes of transformation. And on top of that, if the public-private relationship is one that's used to subsidies and handouts versus a co-investment, strategy of public-private really solving big problems together, then that's much, much harder to do. And, this is where also you see huge differences, as I was mentioning, between European countries on their even willingness to engage in things like conditionalities, but, going more into the public administration issue. One of the things that I think is similar in South Africa and in Italy is that on the one hand, there's a real almost loss of trust with citizens in terms of the public sector. They see it as being too slow, not proactive enough in terms of solving their problems, and people sometimes, whether it's true or not, forget it. But the perception is that, the politicians are in there just for their own careers and they're not really kind of citizen-centered. But on the other hand, there's also this kind of complete missed opportunity sometimes to change that, because all the emphasis just goes towards speeding up the bureaucracy, right? There's too much red tape, bureaucracy is bad. So they have, in Italian, it's called the semplificazione della pubblica amministrazione, this idea that you need to simplify it and that you need to reform it in such a way that often will be sort of fewer people, right? It's too bureaucratic, too many people in public administration, and it's too slow. Speed it up and simplify it. So those concepts are important because, of course, you want things to happen quickly. Slow is not good. However, if the speeding up becomes simplistic and this idea of simplifying, they had a decreto, I don't know how you say it in English. Anyway, un decreto della semplificazione, that misses the opportunity to say, hold on, actually what we have is a really complex situation. There's difficulties that citizens are facing, massive uncertainty. And the way that the public administration needs to reform is actually being able to deal with that complexity, deal with that uncertainty, deal with that citizen engagement that, Georgia was talking about before, in terms of even thinking about what does it mean to have citizen assemblies? What does it mean to listen to citizens' needs? Like, what is empathy 101, in terms of the training that's required? And when you just worry about making the bureaucracy quicker and simplified, you miss the opportunity actually to make it more able to deal with complexity instead of simplicity. And I know that sounds a bit abstract, but it's really where then the problem lies. Because this missions approach, which, you know, as people probably know, that we've been quite critical to bringing to Europe through the mission-oriented policy schemes that then became law in the European Commission, how that then gets nested at the member state level really requires things like procurement. In Italian, it's called appalto. Even the word in Italian is problematic because appalto, which means procurement, is really just looking at the contract. The word procure is quite nice, isn't it? Because it means you kind of want something and you're getting that something by someone. And so it's a relationship, and there's the desire. Like, what do we desire? What needs to be done? And so using procurement, I've written about this in my new book that's coming out in January. If you look at how NASA did its procurement, it was so interesting. They actually rewrote the contracts. They looked at the existing contracts with the private sector and said, we're going to get screwed if it's written like that. Let's write it in a different way. And they even said, there's this fantastic quote, I can't remember who it was. They said, beware of brochuremanship, right? Like the idea that those who are going to want to be getting the procurement contract will present themselves as wonderful, but then you need kind of evidence. Where's the working relationship? Where's the expertise? Where's the willingness to work together, you know, in the long run and not just kind of do a quick contract? And also NASA was very bold by saying we need to be investing in our own understanding of the problem. Even if someone else is going to do it for us, you know, some bit of the spaceship, if we don't understand the science, the technology, we're not going to be able to work with the private sector. And so, you know, so many of these issues is what we see in places like Italy, but I've seen it also in the UK, which is that loss of public sector capacity, that outsourcing of the brain of the public sector. It's fine to outsource some things like, you know, I don't know, catering. I know that's sometimes a big deal also not to do, but anyway, it's, you know, some things are okay to outsource, but you don't outsource your brain. You don't outsource your research and development department. And by that, I don't mean necessarily high-tech research. I mean, literally, any organization needs to do research to understand its environment and its the internal capabilities they require. So that's where I think Italy is today. They're part of a great European recovery scheme. It is like a Marshall Plan, but where it's getting stuck is on the back of decades of lack of public sector investment in their own capacity. So this is something that as counselor of the Prime Minister in Italy, I'm one of his special advisors, I've been stressing, let's, you know, really confront this. And this mission-oriented approach cannot just be about asking all the ministries what they want. You need to be working interministerially, just like we always say intersectorally. Any even health-related mission is not just going to be about the Department of Health. Of course, it's going to have to do also with food, of transport, of mobility. And so being able to work across those sectors and ministries requires a change in how the public sector administration actually plays out.
Thank you. There's so much in that. I mean, I think we heard the phrase build back better a lot really early on in the pandemic. And I think that what's been really interesting about this conversation is actually getting a little bit into the bricks and mortar of what building back better would mean. You know, Mariana, when you talk about beware brochuremanship, I love that, you know, because effectively it's how to not have the cowboy builders. You know, how do you make sure that we're really trying to build something that is foundationally solid and actually isn't just a weak infrastructure that will blow over? I'm going into kind of fairy tale land with Three Little Pigs stuff, but this idea of a Marshall Plan won't really work until you've really got the foundations, or you're starting to really focus on the foundations. And you know, I'm going to really extend this metaphor. I love extending an old metaphor, but what I was really seeing when you were talking was the kind of masonry cracks that were, you used the phrase, Mzou, of a bifurcated society. And, you know, effectively the divides that you talked about and all of you dwelled on, there being some kind of divide, whether that's a digital divide or a social infrastructure divide, or indeed a kind of wealth gap that is really stark and obvious. How do you fill in those masonry cracks? You know, what is the foundations of a resilient economy that means that you do need to invest in that social infrastructure and that you've got legitimacy to do so beyond the, as Mariana referred to in the Italian, the beautiful phrasing you used in Italy, of kind of making things faster. How do you actually go beyond that need to just move fast, but actually that you want to sustain, and that you are about maintenance as well as moving in a fast direction. And I think, you know, to dwell on that social infrastructure, to dwell on the points that Mzou made as well about the mistrust between the private sector and the public sector, specifically in South Africa. Now, that's not going to be the case everywhere, but as Mariana referred to when she's talking about, you know, if the private sector assume that the role of government is just to incentivize in certain ways, that really dwelling on, actually, no, there are new ways that we do this. Conditionality is something that we all have to work on together. They are real foundations of partnerships that will feel very new, but will really need to be tended to. And I think that all of the work that you referred to there is really formed on those foundations of partnerships. Now, I have 3 questions from the audience that I might pull out to put to you. The first one's quite practical, and it came from Greg Hart, specifically for you, Georgia, looking at citizens' councils. And I think that there's been a lot of talk really about deliberative democracy and about citizens' juries, and how these kinds of deliberative fora are mechanisms for opening the door to, as Greg says, real contribution to co-creation. His question is, what would you say are the key principles for ensuring these councils are effective?
Thanks. That is a great question. Just before I answer, I just wanted to quickly just build off what you just said, Mariana just said about state capacity, which I think links to this, because what we've definitely found throughout the pandemic is the importance of being able to shift our capacity and you know, at pace ask people to do different things. But most fundamentally is the relationships that they have. So the kind of biggest change we've seen made in people's lives is through really strong, empowering relationships, which are held by frontline officers. And that means that they sometimes have to do really different things. And the difference it makes when that is your own capacity. I think Mariana said you can't outsource your brain. And I think it's sometimes hard to outsource the care and the ability to stay with a person and to be alongside them in change. And some of the most deep work that we've done around power sharing, I think, has been on that kind of frontline relational change, where we're taking a whole person and not that little bit of them that you've been kind of contracted to take, but taking a whole person and working with them on what it would take to empower and change their lives. So I think that is really critical. But on the question of citizens' assemblies, I really believe in citizens' assemblies as a model, especially in a place like mine, which has those divides where, you know, there are just stark differences in people's lived experience, and it's hard to, if I'm making a kind of policy announcement, or, you know, take the client, we did a climate citizens assembly, and the kind of input to that is some people who think that Camden Council should ban all car users, and then some people who think that we persecute car users, and both who think that very strongly and have, you know, a very different policy response to an issue. And that can sometimes lead to real divides and you know, meetings where 2 different groups of people are shouting their perspective and no one is listening. And also means that in a place like mine, where some people have a lot more time and resource, they can kind of dominate the political processes, and often other voices just aren't heard at all. Planning is a really good example of that. We very rarely hear from young people who are struggling to get on the housing ladder through the planning process. So I think citizens' assemblies are a kind of a robust way of bringing together those different perspectives. And to work, I think that you need a really rigorous process of selection that gets into communities. I think you need to pay people for their time. I remember one of our citizens' assemblies, a young guy got up and he's like, look, to be honest, I only came here for the voucher, but actually it turned out to be the best thing I ever did. And you need that. You can't just have people like me who turn up to, you know, any evening meeting and love talking about how to make my community better. You know, you need people who have busy lives and have made the time because it's been made available to them, or maybe they could pay for childcare as a result of that investment. So I do think investment is really important. I think thirdly, a real promise to take action on at the end of that process. And I think every citizens' assembly I've been part of at the start, there's a like cynicism from the people part of it. Are you really going to listen? Is anything going to change? Is this really meaningful? So that commitment up front to to take the, and it's a risk for local government. We're not used to just opening up and saying we're giving up our power here. You as a deliberative group of mixed citizens will come up with where we go. And that feels risky, but what comes out is absolutely amazing. And I think people say, well, what if it comes up with something really weird or extreme? And what you find is through a proper deliberative process where you're really being completely honest with people about the data and the information and giving them time. You might have one view that is particularly extreme, but it's a conversation, and a well facilitated conversation that every view is heard, and you come to a consensus position that you can move forward on. And the final thing I'd say is that at the moment, there's really a lack of faith in democracy and a lack of trust in democratic processes in many parts of the world. And I think it should be a civic right to be part of that kind of democratic process, to be part of, you don't need to be in every single one, but be part of a democratic process where you negotiate the future of your place, whether it's on climate or on a planning decision or on the future of education. It change you, and you can see that your input has shifted things. I think it can change people's conception of democracy and bring it much closer to people. So you can see I'm very passionate about it.
No, and thank you for that passion, because I think that as Mariana said, you can't outsource your heart. You can't outsource your brain, but you also can't outsource your heart. And it's lovely to see that depth within the work that you do, because I think, for democratic renewal to be real, and we are also experiencing this almost in every single program we work with governments or agencies, there is the question of citizen engagement, but also, what does it mean to share power? What does it mean to co-design with authenticity? And this will mean very different things in very different places. In Canada, it will mean one thing. In New Zealand, it will mean something else. But these principles of sharing power, of really working with the input that comes in and not seeing it as tokenistic, is where we see this kind of real legitimacy and long-termism in setting missions as well. So, where we've seen this work really well, I think, we've seen it, some interesting programs in the Netherlands, in Health Holland, really focuses on a long-term participatory process that sets missions that then you address some of those issues of the kind of mistrust between the different actors, because you're genuinely bringing in a trusted relationship. Thank you for that. I'm going to bring in a question from Canada, from Heather Dusserud, and then I will end with Desi's question. But the question, and I'm going to open it to the panel for whoever would like to answer this, is the panel has mentioned the exacerbation of inequality through the pandemic. I'm wondering, on a practical level, what tactics your organisation's pivoting required? Did this mean recasting of your missions, or development of new partners, or shift in resourcing, or something else? Who would like to come in with what happened? What was the pivot in the COVID challenge? Mariana, I see your mute is off.
Oh, just making sure I was off mute. I mean, maybe I'll say something quickly that I was speaking to the Vatican about last night. So some of our work, as people might know, has been with the Vatican, actually helping to write some briefings for the Pope for his Wednesday speeches, with his first one on Easter Sunday, right after the lockdown basically began, was dedicated to one of the themes we brought up around debt, and how people are actually getting increasingly indebted, of course, during COVID in order to make ends meet. And this is on the back of the financial crisis, which is again caused by record levels of private debt. And the current ratio of private debt to disposable income in the UK is back at the level it was actually just before the crisis. So it's incredibly, incredibly problematic. But what we were talking about last night was actually about the just transition concept, which is a really important one, right? It's all about how even pre-COVID, all the discussion about a Green Deal, it's not going to be that harmonious. A lot of people will be left behind, especially those people working in industries that aren't green. But the problem with the concept of the just transition is that it kind of waits for someone to define the transition, the usual experts, business leaders, policymakers, academics like myself and others, and then someone has to react to it. So labor unions will react to that, saying, oh, wait, hold on, let's make sure that transition is just. While the really radical thing, which is the kind of stuff that I think Camden is so brilliant at, is to bring those voices, labor's voice, the students' voices, the green movement's voice, different voices of nurses, for example, today with the carrying crisis, to the table in designing the missions themselves. In Italian, we say la fase della progettazione, projectification, that sounds terrible in English. Anyway, you know, actually designing the project, not just reacting to someone else's project, right? So that process of co-design, which actually, Rowan, you're brilliant at. You've been talking about design thinking and design processes from your heyday when you were head of strategy at the RSA. That's the stuff we do so bad. It's easy to talk about co-design, but how do you really genuinely bring different voices to the table? And that's going to be messy. That's going to be conflict as well sometimes. And this is why it was great to be kind of, you know, working indirectly with the artist Olafur Eliasson around thinking of public space. He says public space is a space where you feel safe to disagree, right? And if you think of the world of, you know, of fake news, but also hate speech and all the hate that is on our social media platforms, the problem is not the debate and the disagreement. It's when it turns into hate and also a real feel of unsafety. And I think this is something that we should be learning in this moment, which is, again, citizen designing of, you know, these missions themselves. So you don't just have an academic telling you about carbon neutrality, but then investing in those processes that make you create safe spaces. And I think that's really, safe spaces for that discussion. And if you think of the, you know, the level of inequality that exists in South Africa, believe me, if you bring people living under extreme inequality to the table to help government think stuff, it ain't going to be that harmonious. They're going to be angry, rightly angry. And, you know, how do you convene that in a genuine way that's not just tokenistic, patting, you know, the Gretas on the head and saying, okay, you can go now, you've made your point.
That's such an important point. And I think it's something that you, Mariana, often refer to in our meetings with MOIN members and others, which is, you know, this work is not easy. So if you think that missions is a sort of frictionless way forward, you're not approaching it in quite the right way. That doesn't mean that it's not rewarding or that it isn't shooting for the right goals, but to imagine that it won't bring challenge is probably to imagine it wrong. So it's a really interesting thing to see that we're, you know, what are those experimental design spaces or liminal spaces that people can be, so that they can have these shared tensions. And I think, Georgia, you described that really beautifully within the citizen panel in Camden as being a place like that. I'm going to, recognizing we've made it to the end of our session, and I could have a stack more mince pies virtually, but I know that you are all busy people and we need to move on. I'm going to co-opt Desi's question, which Desi is a master's student from the Indonesia School of Government and Public Policy. Her question was quite specific about international assistance, and I'm going to quite pivot it really to ask each of the panelists to give kind of one line really about, you know, the question about what is the current state of 2020 and the difference to the upcoming state of 2021. What are your hopes and your dreams and possibly your fears for the year ahead? Who would like to start?
Let me start so that I can give my colleagues time to reflect on this difficult question. 2020 was extremely hard for individuals, for organizations, for communities, and for countries. And I think the lenses that we've always used to examine public policy, economic policy, trade policy are no longer adequate for going forward. There's been a lot of disruptions at the domestic level, in regions, as well as internationally, and especially also against the backdrop of very nasty geopolitics. And I think the lessons for me, at least, is that states need to be stronger. We don't need weak states, we need stronger states. And states that, or rather governments that recognize the importance of working with key stakeholders, business and civic structures along the lines of what's happening at Camden. But also we need global leaders to have enlightened self-interest, to understand that international cooperation today is much more important than it was yesterday, and that the destiny of the international community is intertwined. So my hopes for 2021 is that governments are a lot more sensitive to citizens' needs and demands, but also more aware of the need to deepen interdependence and cooperation, so that we can tackle the shared challenges and achieve outcomes that serve the greater number of people in the global community. Thanks.
Thank you, Mzou. Georgia, what are your hopes for 2021?
Just to start by saying that, I mean, 2020 has been really tough, and we're kind of ending it in London with new restrictions and feeling, cases are now rising at a rate that takes us back to the start of the pandemic. Kind of coupled with that, I think the economic crisis is going to be as big as the public health one, and we're seeing deepening unemployment. So I think there are huge systemic issues. I think my hopes for 2021 is that it really is a moment for change, that this pandemic has exposed those inequalities that we knew were there, but it's had a public conversation about it, and that we really use this as a moment to kind of pivot our public policy and our economic policy. But I don't think that's assured, and I think it's something that we're going to have to fight for, and it's and really push for, because it could go the opposite direction, and that's why I'm so pleased about the work we're doing with you and with Mariana to kind of be part of battling for that better future.
Brilliant. And Mariana, finally.
I have a positive and a negative one. The positive is I just hope that 2021 gives us more opportunities like this. The whole point of MOIN is to learn from each other what works, what doesn't, and what we call policy sandboxing, testing stuff out and scaling it up. And it can only happen when South Africa speaks to Camden, moments like that. But the negative is, my God, can we just make sure to learn the right lesson? If this, for any reason, starts to bring us back to austerity, given how much governments have put in, I've heard from Georgia, sorry, Georgia, if I hang out the laundry, I've heard from you that you and all the different councils have started hearing words like burden sharing, which basically is the undercover word for austerity, which is the councils have to pay the money back. No, the councils have to do everything they can to make sure that schools, hospitals, streets, housing is as safe and well structured as possible, so that if crises do come like this one, everyone is more resilient. And that's not about cutting, that's about investing more smartly, it's about collaborating. But if this becomes a cutting of schools, a cutting of the frontline workers and their needs and their homes, people live, and the frontline workers have homes, they have children to feed. So we need to be investing in the most ambitious, social, purpose-driven way more than ever. This is not the moment to talk about burden sharing.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much I agree and wholeheartedly support that. I think we would love to continue the conversation throughout the year. I'm grateful for all of the participants who joined us online, and this will be live streamed on the IIPP YouTube channel as well, or the replay will be. Thank you so much to Mzou and to Georgia and Mariana for joining us in such an interesting conversation.
And to you, Rowan.
And thank you. and let's keep it going over the course of next year, because I think, as Georgia was saying, this is not the end of the road. We are in the middle of the road. So let's keep going with hope in our hearts and not outsourcing our brains towards the kind of really building that resilience that you speak of. So, but other than that, I just want to say thank you guys, and we'll see you again in the year. Happy New Year to everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rowan. Thanks. Thank you.
And thanks to the whole IPP team, Nora, Victoria, everyone in the background there.
Absolutely. Couldn't do it without them.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.